A calm day by the pool turns into a storm of prejudice and assumptions until power, truth and legacy rise to the surface. This isn't just about a pool, it's about respect. And what happens when you underestimate the wrong man? Afternoon sun spilled gold across the surface of the private infinity pool, water shimmering like melted crystal. A gentle breeze rustled the palms, carrying the scent of lemon trees and trimmed grass. Reclining in a teak lounger under a white umbrella was a black man, dressed in tailored linen slacks and a casual button-down shirt. He was the picture of calmest tea sweating on the table beside him, leather-bound book open in his hand, his feet resting on a neatly rolled towel. The mansion behind him stood silent and serene, a marvel of glass, steel, and stone, with arched walkways and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the blue sky above. But peace doesn't always last, especially when arrogance and prejudice creep in uninvited. It's just beyond the high fence. Two neighbors, an uptight woman in a visor and a red-faced husband, peeked through the slats, their brows furrowed with confusion, then skepticism, then something uglier. The woman whispered, sharply, as if the sight offended her. "Who is that?" she hissed. "That's not the homeowner." Something's wrong. The man at the pool lifted his gaze momentarily, sensing the shift in air like a storm forming far away. Returned to his book, unbothered. Wouldn't drop it. They circled to the side gate, stepping closer to the edge of the property. Their voices grew louder. "Excuse me?" the woman barked. "Can we help you with something?" The man closed his book, placed it gently on the table, and turned his head. "No," he said calmly. "I'm good, just enjoying the day." "This is private property," the husband added, squinting. "You can't just hang out by someone else's pool." "I know," the man said, his tone still even. "It's mine." The woman scoffed. "Yours?" "I don't think so. We've lived in this neighborhood for 10 years and never seen you before." He gave a light nod. "I've been here longer." It only made them more suspicious. The husband stepped forward slightly, puffing his chest like a man used to getting his way. "Look, we don't want any trouble, but you're going to need to prove that. People don't just show up at places like this." "I didn't show up," the man replied. "I live here." The woman's face twisted with impatience, calling HOA security. "If you really live here, you won't mind a little verification." He didn't flinch. "Do what you feel is necessary." She pulled out her phone, turning slightly so he could hear the call. "Yes. This is Linda from Maplecrest Lane. There's a suspicious man on the Johnson estate. Dark skin, late 30s. He claims he lives here, but we know the real owner. Something's not right," her husband added in a mutter, "probably squatting. That place has been too quiet lately. No one with that kind of money sits around alone reading books." The man remained seated, motionless, but alert. The subtle insult, the layered implication, the thinly veiled racism, none of it was new to him. He had faced it at boardrooms, at airports, at charity galas. But it was always disappointing. Every time, how small-minded people could be in the presence of success they couldn't comprehend. Minutes later, 2 uniformed HOA security officers arrived, their golf cart kicking up gravel as they parked by the curb. The neighbors rushed over to them like concerned citizens delivering a tip to detectives. "There he is," the woman pointed. "By the pool, he says he owns it, but we know that's not true." The security guards, a man and a woman, strode across the lawn without hesitation, ignoring the landscaping signs and crossing flower beds. They approached the lounging man with rehearsed suspicion. "Sir," one of them said firmly, "we're going to need to see some identification." He looked up at them, sun catching the reflection in his sunglasses. "And what's your probable cause for asking that?" "We received a report," the guard replied, hand on his belt. "We're just doing our job." "Did the report say I was armed, dangerous, committing a crime?" "Doesn't matter," the female officer added. "We have authority in this HOA." He smiled slightly. "Then you should know that this property is privately owned, not subject to common access. You're trespassing without a warrant or legal cause." The guards exchanged a glance, slightly thrown off. The neighbors remained close, filming with their phones. The woman zoomed in with commentary under her breath. "Still won't show ID, just sitting there like he owns the place. Can you believe this?" Her husband leaned closer to her, muttering, "We should have just called the police. This guy's a professional con." The guards began to get more assertive. "We're giving you one more chance, sir. Produce ID, or we'll escalate." "Go ahead," he said quietly, voice like still water. "Do what you need to do." The female officer grabbed her radio. "Dispatch, we may have a trespasser refusing cooperation, requesting local PD." The man didn't raise his voice, didn't rise, didn't beg. Instead, he reached for his phone. With one simple swipe, he unlocked the screen, scrolled briefly, then held the device to his ear. "Activate it," he said into the phone. "I want full visibility, right now." He hung up. No one knew what that meant, but something had changed. The wind shifted. Somewhere on the rooftop, a barely visible drone began to rise silently. Surveillance devices, undetectable to the average, blinked to life, recognizing faces, syncing footage, and streaming directly to encrypted servers. But all the neighbors and officers saw was the man still calm, still seated sipping his tea and waiting. The sky overhead remained clear, the breeze still soft, but something invisible had shifted. From the edges of the mansion's slate roof, 4 surveillance drones lifted silently into the air, no louder than a whisper. Hovered above the property, their dark shells catching glints of sunlight as they repositioned with military precision. From the garden hedges, wall panels, and light fixtures, high-definition AI-powered cameras came to life, their lenses turning and locking onto targets' every face, every movement, every device. Facial recognition kicked in, scanning the HOA, officers, the neighbors, even the vehicles parked outside. Flags lit up on the man's private server. Trespassers, unauthorized video recording, false report in progress. The data streamed live into his phone, which now glowed with feeds from every angle of the property. He glanced briefly at the screen split into 9 camera views, then placed the phone back down on the table beside him, letting the tech do the talking. The guards, still posturing, had yet to notice they were being scanned from multiple angles. Their movements recorded, their body language analyzed, their voices transcribed and time-stamped. The neighbors, still filming, were unknowingly being filmed in return, or a word of slander captured. Every eye roll, every smug chuckle, stored in redundant backups across secure cloud networks. Then, one by one, vehicles began to arrive at the front gates. First, a sleek black sedan with diplomatic plates, from which stepped a woman in a tailored navy suit. She walked directly across the manicured lawn without pause, her heels sharp against the stone. She carried a slim leather briefcase and radiated authority. A moment later, a hybrid SUV pulled up behind her. Now it came to men, one with a tablet in hand, the other holding a drone controller. They wore no uniforms, but the energy around them was unmistakable. Professionals. The first woman reached the group at the pool and spoke clearly, addressing the HOA security without preamble. "Are currently operating outside your legal jurisdiction. This property is under executive-level protection, both private and federal. You are hereby issued a cease and desist. Any further engagement will be considered criminal trespass." She handed a folder to the startled security officer, who looked down at the gold-embossed letterhead, his confidence visibly draining as he read the name on the document. The man still lounging in the chair hadn't said another word. The neighbors stepped back slightly, their faces twitching between confusion and nervousness. The woman with the visor finally spoke, voice losing its edge. "Look, we were just trying to help. We thought maybe someone broke in." The second assistant, tall.com, carrying a digital pad, spoke next. "We have facial footage confirming your approach to the property line. You entered private land. You recorded an individual without consent. And you submitted a knowingly false report to HOA security." "That's not true," the husband blurted out. We didn't know who he was." "And you still don't," the assistant replied flatly at that moment. The HOA president arrived, breathless, clearly called in at the last minute. He marched across the yard, barking at his officers to explain the situation. Ow. But as he reached the center of the commotion and laid eyes on the man in the chair, he froze mid-step. His face went pale. Recognition landed on him like a punch to the gut. "Oh," he muttered. "Oh my God." Silence rippled through the group now, at last. The man stood up. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His height was commanding, his posture dignified, and his expression unreadable. The assistant stepped aside as he approached the HOA president, who could barely maintain eye contact. "I didn't realize." The president stammered. "We weren't told. I thought the property was unoccupied." "You didn't think?" one of the assistants interrupted. "You assumed." The man walked slowly toward the edge of the pool deck, where a glass wall framed the living room inside the mansion. Through it, glimpses of his life shimmered in quiet defiance of every assumption made about him. A grand piano sat beside a fireplace. Wards lined the shelves. Tech innovation, humanitarian impact, leadership. One wall bore a photo of him shaking hands with the state governor, both smiling beneath an American flag. Times magazine cover hung nearby with his face. Beneath the bold headline, "The Mind Behind the Machines." The guards looked at each other, their previous confidence fully dissolved. The neighbors were no longer filming. The woman held her phone loosely. Her earlier bravado turned to shame. She tried again to soften the impact. "Maybe we overreacted," she said weakly. "We just didn't know who you were." The man finally spoke again, voice smooth and precise. "You didn't have to know who I was. You only had to know I was human." His words didn't rise in volume, but they struck like thunder. The husband cleared his throat. "It's just you don't understand. There's been a lot of crime lately, break-ins, vandalism, none of which happened here." The assistant cut in. "And none of which gives you license to interrogate your neighbors." The man's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen. A live video had just finished uploading his own security footage, stitched with timestamps annotated. In real time. A full legal package ready to be submitted to local authorities and national news outlets, if he so desired. He looked back at the president, who now stood in stiff silence, sweat beading on his forehead. "There's a pattern here," the man said. "You assume guilt based on appearance. You wield authority without fact. And when the truth confronts you, you pretend it's all a misunderstanding." The president opened his mouth, but the man raised a hand. "Save it. This isn't about one afternoon. It's about a culture of arrogance, dressed up as concern. Bind." One of the assistants received a call, nodded, and then leaned in to speak quietly to the man. "Media inquiries have begun. Your foundation team suggests we draft a public statement within the hour." He nodded once. Then slowly he turned back to the group still gathered in confusion and regret. "You came here thinking you had power?" he said calmly. "You forgot that real power is quiet. It watches, it records, it remembers." With nothing left to say, he picked up his iced tea, took a long sip, and returned to his chair beneath the umbrella. The drones above adjusted their position slightly, continuing their silent patrol. The neighbors stood motionless, shamed but unsure how to leave. The guard stepped back, still holding the cease-and-desist folder like it might catch fire. And the president, face flushed with humiliation, slowly backed away, understanding far too late that he hadn't walked onto someone else's property. He'd walked into someone else's world. The days that followed were anything but quiet. What began as a moment of leisure interrupted by ignorance had erupted into a movement. A press release appeared online from a respected civil rights law firm, bearing a familiar name at the top. In formal language, it confirmed what many had begun to suspect. The man who had been harassed at his own poolside estate was filing a lawsuit, not just against the individuals who had confronted him, but against the entire homeowners association responsible for enabling and protecting patterns of discrimination. The statement outlined clear terms: civil harassment, racial profiling, and abuse of authority, and ended with a declaration: "We will not be silenced, not even behind gated fences." Within hours, the press showed up. Cameras lined the sidewalk. Outside the mansion's towering black gates, microphones, drones, and smartphones pointed toward the property like weapons of truth. Journalists stood under umbrellas, reading updates as they happened. Billionaire speaks out on racial discrimination in luxury community. Another black homeowner targeted. When will it stop? Lawsuit filed against Maple Crest. HOA. Then came the footage. The man's legal team having secured footage from both his private surveillance and the HOA body cams. Released a highly edited but brutally effective 2-minute clip. It showed the neighbors confronting him. Showed the security officers questioning him with arrogance. It showed the quiet call he made to activate the surveillance network. And finally, it showed the look on the HOA president's face when he realized just who he had underestimated. That video traveled across platforms in minutes, and by nightfall, it had already passed 15 million views. Influencers reacted first with fiery commentary. Activists, lawyers, educators, celebrities, everyone weighed in. You can own $1 billion estate and still be treated like a threat in your own backyard, one tweet read. Another post on Instagram paired a still of the man sipping iced tea with the caption, "Grace under pressure, power under control." The backlash for the HOA was immediate. Major brands that had previously sponsored events or initiatives in the Maple Crest community began issuing carefully worded statements and pulling funding. A private golf resort announced it would be canceling its HOA-sponsored tournament. Investment firm with real estate holdings in the area quietly dropped all future partnerships. But it didn't stop at bad PR. Investigators, both legal and journalistic, began digging deeper. And what they found was damning. Records surfaced showing that black homeowners in the community had been disproportionately fined for minor infractions: flower pots in the wrong color, fences 1 inch too high, kids' toys visible from the street. Building permits had been denied without explanation. Complaints were routinely lost. Whispered rumors turned into sworn testimonies. The man, now firmly in control of the narrative, announced the launch of a task force, funded with a 7-figure endowment from his philanthropic foundation. It was designed to track HOA abuses nationwide, provide legal aid, and create a database of racial and economic profiling by neighborhood associations. "This isn't about me," he said during a streamed statement from inside his estate's marble-columned hall. "This is about every person who's ever been made to feel like a stranger in their own home." The HOA board was collapsing under the weight of accountability. Members began resigning quietly, hoping to escape further scrutiny, but there would be no escape. A mandatory meeting was called, held not at the clubhouse, but at the mansion. The same one they had trespassed upon. No one declined the invitation. Inside, the great room was cleared of furniture, turned into a formal chamber. A long table stretched across the space, with seating arranged like a corporate hearing. The man entered last, flanked by his legal counsel on one side and a pair of silent security professionals on the other. No one spoke as he approached. They stood in his presence, unsure whether it was out of respect or fear. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply laid out the facts, and then he offered a choice. You can resign, you can reform, or you can be removed by force of law. Either way, this ends now. Hung their heads. Others tried to speak, but found no words that could soften the truth. One woman, eyes brimming, stood up and addressed the room. Her voice trembled. "I was pressured," she said. "I didn't want to get involved, but the board said we had to be consistent. I thought I was protecting the community." She looked directly at him. "I'm sorry." He listened. He believed her. But he didn't let her off the hook. "Courage isn't quiet agreement," he said. "It's action when it costs you something. But thank you for being the first to stand up now." She sat down again, tears falling silently. The meeting ended with signatures, resignations, policy revisions, formal agreements to transfer oversight of HOA procedures to a third-party ethics firm. The man's lawyers collected each document. With methodical precision, mood in the room was one of absolute clarity. They had crossed the wrong man, and yet, despite everything, he had not retaliated with vengeance. He had responded with law, with transparency, and with a vision bigger than himself. Not just to correct the offense, but to prevent the next one. Outside, the media waited for a quote. But he gave none. He simply walked out, looked up at the blue sky, and let the silence speak louder than any headline ever could. The changes came swiftly, not just as a response to public pressure, but as a reckoning. The HOA board, that had once held meetings behind closed doors, issuing arbitrary fines and enforcing rules with quiet prejudice was gone. In their place, a newly elected leadership took over, diverse in race, background, and profession. A civil rights attorney now sat as chair. Former urban planner handled policy. Single mother, once targeted for repainting her door the wrong shade of blue, now led the community outreach committee. Policies were rewritten from the ground up. Every rule was examined through the lens of equity. Every enforcement action now required documentation, justification, and oversight. Transparency portals were launched online. Complaints had to be logged and responded to within 7 days. All board meetings became open to residents, recorded, and available for playback. What had once been a system designed to control had been redesigned to protect. The couple who falsely accused him, the woman with the visor, and the red-faced man who had barked accusations through the fence, received court orders to vacate the neighborhood. Their actions had not only violated HOA code and local trespass laws, but had triggered a defamation clause tied to their mortgage agreements, nullifying their eligibility to remain on the property. They fought it in court, tried to twist it as a misunderstanding, but the judge had already seen the footage. No anger had to be raised. The truth did all the speaking. When they left, their property was quickly bought by a family from another state. The new owners brought with them a backyard trampoline, a therapy dog, and 3 curious children who waved at everyone. No one missed the former tenants. The security officers who had arrived so confidently, demanding ID from the man who owned the estate, were quietly stripped of their licenses. The private firm that had employed them faced public scrutiny. Within weeks, was dropped from several other neighborhoods. One officer attempted to sue for wrongful termination. The case didn't last a week. Every second of the incident was documented from half a dozen angles. No spin could undo the image of them standing over a peaceful man like enforcers guarding someone else's home. There was no someone else. It had always been his. The lawsuit he filed was successful, but it was never about the money. Settlement, hefty and historic, was wired directly into the accounts of several civil rights housing groups the moment it cleared. Organizations that had fought for years against discriminatory zoning laws, racist lending practices, and neighborhood redlining suddenly found themselves funded well beyond their expectations. Programs expanded overnight. Legal defense clinics opened in cities that had never had them. Hotline wait times dropped. In dozens of communities across the country, homeowners of color received calls from lawyers offering help they hadn't even known to ask for. But the man wasn't finished. He stood at a podium weeks later, not as a victim, but as a visionary. In front of a packed auditorium, in a live stream watched by hundreds of thousands, he announced the creation of a new national foundation, one with a singular goal: to end HOA discrimination in America. Backed by his resources, expertise, and relentless resolve, the foundation would track complaints, offer pro bono legal representation, and create a national index of HOA behavior. Transparency was no longer optional. He spoke not with anger, but with clarity, saying, a home should be a sanctuary, not a battleground. This country was built on ownership. Let's make sure we honor everyone who earns the right to call a place home. Congress took notice. Within a month, he was invited to testify at a housing equality hearing. Lawmakers, lobbyists, and advocates sat silently as he detailed his experience, not for sympathy, but for systemic clarity. He brought data. He brought stories. He brought solutions. His testimony sparked new bills, inspired coalitions, and sent ripples through agencies that had long neglected the undercurrent of prejudice within gated communities. What had once been dismissed as isolated incidents were now being recognized as coordinated patterns, and the story didn't end there. A documentary crew, initially covering the viral footage, had requested permission to follow the cases. Aftermath. What began as a short news segment evolved into a full-length feature. It aired on a major streaming service with millions of subscribers. Titled Behind the Gate, the film followed not just the man, but the residents whose lives were touched by the changes he set in motion. Viewers watched as communities redefined themselves, as laws were debated, and as a quiet man by a pool transformed into a symbol of unshakable dignity. Weeks later, away from the cameras and courtrooms, The estate was quiet again. The pool sparkled beneath the early afternoon sun, but this time it wasn't solitude that filled the space. Children laughed as they raced through sprinklers. Friends gathered around the grill, telling stories and clinking glasses. Neighbors new and old sat comfortably on cushioned deck chairs, basking not just in the warmth of the sun, but in the sense of true belonging. The man sat once again in his favorite chair, book nearby, iced tea in hand. He wore the same relaxed shirt, the same peaceful expression, this time though he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by what the place had been missing all along: community. Across the lawn, a young woman walked over, holding the hand of a toddler. She smiled brightly and extended a friendly wave. "Thank you," she said, voice soft, but sincere, "for everything. You made this place feel safe for everyone." He nodded, taking a sip of his tea, letting the moment breathe before replying. "Now that's the neighborhood I always imagined." The camera didn't zoom in, the music didn't swell. There were no headlines here, no breaking news, just the sound of wind through trees. It's the laughter of children, and the quiet satisfaction of a legacy secured not through anger or revenge, but through purpose, resilience, and justice.